You've probably noticed it. Ever since COVID-19 hit, it feels like the global economy has been suffocating under just a relentless, never-ending sequence of shocks. We're talking supply chain breakdowns, historic inflation, sudden banking instability, and major geopolitical warfare. So we have to ask ourselves, is this just an unprecedented, terrible run of bad luck, or are we actually looking at the symptoms of a much deeper, systemic disease? In this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain on the architecture of our modern world to find out.
The big question we're tackling today is whether we're currently transitioning into a fundamentally new historical era. To do that, we're going to test some major historical analogies, think the 1918 flu pandemic or the stagflation of the 1970s, against the hard, modern macroeconomic data. We want to figure out if these cascading events are truly random or if they're actually the manifestation of deep, repeating historical cycles.
To make sense of all this, we've put together a bit of a roadmap for our explainer today. We'll start by defining exactly what a global polycrisis is. Then, we'll dive into lessons from past historical shocks, unpack the actual mechanics of these cascading crises, explore the massive shift from economic efficiency to resilience, assess where our biggest future vulnerabilities lie, and finally, look at how we navigate what we're calling a turbulent normalcy. Let's jump in.
All right, let's start by getting our terms straight and unpacking what we mean by a global polycrisis.
The term polycrisis was actually first coined back in 1993 by Edgar Morin and Anne Brigitte Kern, and it essentially describes a nightmare scenario where crises across multiple different global systems become completely, causally entangled with one another. These interacting shocks end up producing harms that are far, far worse than they ever would be in isolation. They feed off each other, basically mutating and transforming the original problems into something entirely new.
Now, here is a really crucial point. We absolutely have to distinguish fundamental, structural crises from their mere symptoms. Things like sudden inflation spikes, a localized bank failure, or a bottleneck at a shipping port. Those are the things that grab the headlines. But more often than not, they are just the visible symptoms of massive tectonic shifts happening beneath the surface in global capitalism, ecology, and international relations.
So what can history teach us about these underlying shifts? Well, as the saying goes, history might not repeat itself perfectly, but it often rhymes. Back in 2020, a lot of observers immediately pointed to the 1918 influenza pandemic to try and predict COVID-19's economic fallout. But if you look closely, the underlying demographics completely changed the math here. In 1918, the mortality was heavily concentrated in the prime-age working demographic. That triggered a massive labor supply shock, which actually drove manufacturing wages up by something like 23 percentage points in the hardest-hit areas. COVID-19, on the other hand, predominantly impacted an older demographic, so relying on the 1918 playbook drastically overestimates the long-term labor shock we're dealing with today. The patients were fundamentally different, and therefore, the resulting economy is different.
We actually see a very similar divergence when people try to compare the 1970s stagflation era to our post-COVID world. Yes, absolutely. Both eras experienced major supply shocks and crazy spikes in energy prices. But the context is entirely different. Inflation averaged around 10.1% back then, compared to roughly 4.0% recently. Today's global economy is far less dependent on energy. It has much lower energy intensity. And, crucially, modern central banks now have highly credible, battle-tested frameworks for maintaining price stability, which completely contrast with the confusing competing monetary goals they had in the 70s.
Okay, so if the past isn't a perfect mirror, let's look at the actual architecture of these modern cascading crises. How do they mechanically work?
Fascinating research from the Cascade Institute actually maps out the physical and informational conduits of our world today. They look at energy, physical matter, information, and even biological material as vectors. And because we've built these incredibly dense, planet-spanning webs, our supply chains, our telecommunications, our global financial systems, a localized stress almost never stays local anymore. These conduits effectively allow a shock originating in one tiny region to just seamlessly infect the entire global body. It spreads like wildfire.
Because everything is so hyper-connected, our global networks now exhibit what scientists refer to as nonlinearity and hysteresis. Now, nonlinearity basically means that a tiny, seemingly insignificant disruption can trigger a disproportionately massive change. And hysteresis, that's the terrifying rule that once a complex system flips completely out of its normal equilibrium, say a totally collapsed supply chain, that flip is often permanent. You can't unring the bell. Returning to the so-called old normal isn't just difficult. Scientifically speaking, it's often impossible.
This brings us to a major structural shift happening right now. We are moving away from an era of pure efficiency and into an era of deep resilience.
You see, for nearly 30 years, global trade was defined by what we could call fragile efficiency. The entire goal was producing goods at the absolute lowest possible cost, relying on ultra-lean, just-in-time manufacturing. But the pandemic and the geopolitical shocks that followed completely shattered that model. The research shows a massive reorientation is underway. We're shifting to just-in-case manufacturing. Companies are suddenly prioritizing deep safety buffers, bringing manufacturing back home through reshoring, and heavily diversifying their supply chains. Cost savings are no longer the only thing that matters.
But here's the catch. Resilience isn't free. Empirical data shows that firms are now willingly eating what we call a resilience premium of roughly 12 to 15%. They are literally paying a premium to protect their production and distribution networks from whatever global shock inevitably comes next. Think of it like a massive insurance policy. Global trade is no longer just a game of pure economics. It is now inextricably tied to national security and environmental survival.
So with all this in mind, let's assess the landscape right now. Where are our biggest vulnerabilities looking forward?
If we look at a Federal Reserve survey of major market contacts, we see a really stark, undeniable shift in what's keeping people up at night. Between late 2025 and spring of 2026, geopolitical risk absolutely surged. It aggressively overtook things like persistent inflation, private credit woes, and policy uncertainty to become the absolute primary fear. The market is screaming at us that the threat of structural global conflict is now far more dangerous than standard, run-of-the-mill economic cycles.
At the same time, we have to keep a very close eye on systemic leverage. When we look at early warning data from BVR research, which specifically tracks the likelihood of banking crises, there are persistent flashing red lights over the world's two largest economies, China and the United States. Both of these giants have exceptionally elevated and growing levels of private leverage, and that leaves them both deeply, deeply vulnerable to any sudden financial shocks.
And when we pivot to look at public, sovereign debt, it's really a tale of two worlds. We are officially in the fourth great wave of global debt accumulation of the last 50 years. But the early warning data reveals a massive divide. Advanced economies, despite sitting on mountains of debt, remain fairly far from imminent fiscal stress. However, persistent warning signals are flashing brightly across emerging Europe, Latin America, and Africa. When you combine their high public debt with really problematic interest-to-growth differentials, you are essentially setting the stage for very severe localized fiscal collapses in those specific regions.
Finally, let's pull all these threads together and talk about how we navigate what comes next, the future of our global order.
There is a fascinating, almost sci-fi layer to this modern polycrisis, and that's the rise of immense private technological power. Think about figures like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. They are leveraging absolutely unprecedented wealth to act almost like quasi-sovereign entities. They're governing critical global digital and satellite infrastructures. This effectively bypasses traditional state authority and adds a totally wild, unpredictable variable to global stability. It's a dynamic that traditional governments are really struggling to coordinate against.
Economically speaking, all of these factors mean we're entering a brand new era of what we call complexity inflation. That comfortable, deflationary stability we enjoyed for the last 30 years, which was driven by that hyper-efficient, fragile global trade we talked about, that era is definitively over. As the whole world frantically shifts toward supply chains that are actually resilient, secure, and heavily regulated, there's going to be persistent, structural upward pressure on costs. It's just the necessary price we have to pay to survive a polycrisis.
So, we find ourselves living in a state of turbulent normalcy. Like we said, history doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but understanding these rhyming patterns is genuinely our only path to preparedness. Yes, our tools for macroeconomic management have definitely improved over the decades, but our systemic vulnerabilities, those have grown exponentially faster. So I'll leave you with this final thought. As the very architecture of our global economy fundamentally transforms, are our institutions actually equipped to navigate a permanent, never-ending state of polycrisis? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.